Green, and I am the Deputy Executive Officer for operations here at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. That's why we're here tonight. We're here to demonstrate to you that we are taking steps to do things differently at the Air District. And we are here so that we can meet the call for full transparency as we work to protect our communities. The Valero Benicia refinery is being taken to the hearing board on March 15th, 2022 to end a serious emissions violation related to an undisclosed pollution source at that facility. An Air District investigation found an unreported emission source at Valero that vented over 10,000 tons of hydrocarbons over several years. And this release included toxic air pollutants. These emissions exceed Air District's regulatory limits. It's never okay to exceed an emissions limit, and it's never okay to hide emissions. We believe that this community would say the same thing, and we think it's time we moved on from the old way of doing things through prolonged negotiations with emitters to now taking formal legal action in a public forum to require abatement of these types of emissions. We'll hopefully tell you more about this case tonight and answer all of your questions. We've used our hearing board very few times over the last 20 plus years, and we think it's time that that changed. Some of this recent journey has been slow and difficult for us as an organization, but we believe change takes real effort and commitment to act differently. We've tried working with Valero internally, and some progress has been made on emissions, where they have been reduced from this vent, but they have not been eliminated. We've also had to go back and look at our internal processes. And while we're grateful to the dedicated Air District staff who worked diligently on this case, we could have done better, and we should have done better sooner. Tonight, we welcome the input, comments, concerns, and questions of all. And I want to thank you for your attention, for turning out tonight to be part of this conversation. And with that, I'll hand you back to Joshua. So the Valero refinery itself was built in 1969. It's an integrated facility, which means that the process units flow into one another and cannot easily be taken down to make repairs without taking the whole facility down. The facility itself is quite large. It processes about 165,000 barrels of crude oil a day. That's around 7 million gallons of crude oil per day. And the site itself is sprawling and contains storage tanks, emission sources, abatement devices, and emissions points. Some of the abatement devices that are most visible to folks, I think, are the 3 flares at the facility. And then there's a spaghetti or forest of thousands of valves, flanges, pumps, and connectors, all of which have requirements under Air District regulations relative to their emissions. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we're talking about, if you take a look at the photograph here on your left, that very skinny pipe is where we discovered these emissions. And then you can see on the other side of the photograph its relation to the community and where it is in the facility itself. Next slide, please. So as far as the Air District can determine, we believe that this emissions point may have been in use, as far back as 2000 when Valero acquired this facility. We know that Valero was doing sampling at this facility for its own processes and the production of oil as far back as 2003. The emissions from this particular event are in excess of the limits that are in Regulation 802, which only allows 15 pounds of emissions from any single source in a given day. Based on our calculations here, this particular source was emitting at over 4,000 pounds per day. And in terms of the overall emissions from this source, based on the samples that were taken by Valero and the Air District and our estimates, we think that there was over 10,000 tons of hydrocarbon emissions from this vent, and that included some toxic air contaminants. Next slide, please. So how did we happen upon this particular event? In December 2018, we had another facility report to us about a venting of emissions from a process that they normally have controlled. When we discovered that, we decided to look at all of our 5 facilities to make sure this type of venting wasn't occurring in a manner that was not being reported to the Air District. Based on our investigation, in March of 2019, we issued a notice of violation to Valero for an emissions point where they were not reporting to us. Valero at that point did volunteer to institute an engineering fix to mitigate those emissions, and by October of 2019, that fix went into place. It was hoped at that time that this would cure the violation, but as the Air District and Valero continued to monitor this particular emissions point, it became clear by May of 2020 that while the emissions were mitigated during normal operations, they continued during startup shutdowns and malfunctions. Between May of 2020 and the present, the Air District has been working with Valero to evaluate a number of engineering solutions to prevent all emissions from this point, but at this point, we have not gotten any satisfactory explanation from the facility on how they plan to end these emissions. So with that particular backdrop, the Air District has chosen to take this facility to our hearing board to get a stipulated order of abatement. Next slide, please. So the current status is that some of the hydrocarbons have been reduced, a fairly substantial emissions reduction. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing only emissions from startup shutdown and malfunction that continue to exceed our standards. And while the emissions have been reduced, our models still show that they exceed the limits that the Air District's Board of Directors has deemed to be have deemed to be healthy for facilities, and that means that they need to control. Next slide, please. So on March 15th, 2020, the Air District is going to take Valero to our hearing board to request a stipulated order of abatement. And this order of abatement addresses the emissions violation. It covers additional reporting and permitting issues. Additional permitting and other issues are still being investigated, and this particular action is targeted at reducing the emissions portion of the violation only. The order itself requires cleanup to be as soon as feasible, but no later than the next refinery turnaround. I explained earlier about some of the difficulties in effecting repairs at this facility because of its integrated nature. But any equipment that's installed will require an Air District permit, and there may also be requirements for that equipment to get a CEQA and building permits from the city of Benicia. In the interim, we are also requiring that this facility continue to monitor emissions from this vent. So that ends my brief presentation, and I'll hand it back to Josh.
Damien, I can't see hands and things, so I'll let you do that. So here on this slide is the overview of the emissions and the violations. So they were emissions of non-methane hydrocarbons. And the only reason why we mentioned this is that's how the Regulation 8 Rule 2 limit is written. It's in non-methane hydrocarbons. Normally, we look at hydrocarbons as precursor organic compounds. So when we talk about pounds per day, we're usually talking about precursor organic compounds. And then the types of toxics that are in this precursor organic compound stream are benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. We normally call this BTEX, and these are, these are what we find in gasoline. So I did talk about hydrocarbons because this is where they're in excess of Regulation 8, Rule 2. The limit is in 15 pounds of hydrocarbon per day, and at some points they were at 4,000 pounds of hydrocarbon per day. So they're in excess of our Regulation 8, Rule 2. The amount of emissions over a 17-year period were approximately 10,000 tons of organics and 138 tons of the BTEX, the benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. So we ran a health risk assessment on the toxic air contaminants. And so in this table, you can see what it was historically. Cancer risk, chronic hazard index, and acute hazard index. And then in October of 2019, they put in their engineering fix, which we're calling a jump over line to be able to try to minimize those emissions. So cancer risk dropped to 0.7 in a million, the chronic hazard index to 0.01, and the acute hazard index to 1.7. And the thing to note here is if you look at our thresholds where we require abatement, those are in yellow. So right now, even with the jump over, they still need to abate those emissions. This is a map of the locations. So here, the 1.7 is the orange section, and in the yellow, this is where they still exceed the requirement to put in controls or install controls. So the thing to point out is the emissions from startup, shutdown, and malfunctions continue. So they did reduce their emissions by 70%, as Damien had stated, when they put in the jump over lines, but we're still seeing emissions and exceedances of Regulation 8, Rule 2 during startup, shutdown, and malfunction. So they still exceed regulatory thresholds and are required to install controls, which is why we're taking them to the hearing board. I'm going to turn, anyone want to see any of these?
I think Damien was responding to whether there would be a criminal prosecution, and then the follow-up was why it took 3 years.
So at this point, we can't comment on, we don't have that criminal authority, right? And we are not going to comment on what other agencies or other folks are thinking about at this particular point. All I can let you know is that from the Air District's perspective, we are taking the actions that we need to get this thing cleaned up. And that means taking these folks to our hearing board where we can have public and transparent comment on the fix and on the case itself.
I think that there are basically two types of risks that were posed by those emissions. One was the acute risk of exposure to these agents that were released, and for people with underlying respiratory conditions like asthma, emphysema, bronchitis, these exposures can potentially exacerbate their underlying health issue. Mild exacerbations might impede their activities of daily living, or severe impacts could land them in an emergency room. And so I don't think it's possible to say that no harm occurred during those many years of release. It may not have been many individuals. It's impossible to say because we wouldn't have had any real-time information. But I don't think it's possible to say that nobody was harmed by it. That said, those are acute issues. The exacerbation occurs, and then there isn't presumably a lasting effect from the exacerbation itself. The other set of risks are chronic disease risks, and the agents that were referred to by Damien include carcinogens like benzene. And the answer as to how much risk was posed by those cancer-causing emissions is difficult because there's really two different answers. One is that if you look at the overall probability of a cancer case occurring, it amounts to something less than one case occurring in Benicia over the full 20 years of exposure. But that's not the same thing as to say what was the risk, because the acceptance of that level of cancer by the Benicia community is predicated on the community being willingly complicit with the release, which it clearly wasn't. those releases were above the standard. The standards are what we all agree to when we have a facility like this in our community. So any release and any risk that's attendant with that release above the standard is inherently an unacceptable risk because it violates the compact that the community has with the facility through the air district and its standards. So, can you find a person who developed cancer as a result? Odds are probably not, but that's not really the point. I think the point is that that no exceedance, no risk, no exposure to benzene from this facility into the community of Benicia is acceptable. And I think that therefore, however low that risk number may seem, I don't think it's right to say that it was a non-risk scenario.
Yeah.
Related to what was just said, I don't think it should have taken 4 years to get to this point, and that we have another year to wait before we have a reliable data that's verifiable coming from an H2S fence line monitoring system that was installed as far back, I don't know, between 2019 and 2020. And so that seems like a very long time to allow for corrections to be made or compliance. But the reason I had raised my hand in the first place was, first of all, I appreciated Ken's comments about the systemic problems, about communication, using the community, people in the community as a resource to the district, because for instance, in the last 3 times of incidents very recently, the incident about, quote unquote, oil falling from the sky that happened that probably affected, because I asked at the CAP meeting, how many households were affected? How many properties in Benicia? Well, they didn't at first want to say that, but finally I said, just give me a ballpark. Okay, 200 houses affected by oil falling out of the sky that was on gardens, children's toys, cars, solar systems, you name it. Even fake grass was mentioned as a problem, cleaning fake grass. Valero did not just go out of its way to contact people immediately when they knew there was a problem. They waited for people to call them. Furthermore, the only way I learn about these things is because I'm listening to KQED while I'm doing chores in the morning, and I hear a report from Mr. Goldberg, I think that's his name, and I'm very grateful to him, that he makes a report he did today about this hearing. And so if the district is calling KQED to help them know that something's going on, I appreciate that. But it's a little shocking to learn about things like the abatement order from KQED. That should have gone from the district immediately to our city, not to Valero. I mean, Valero is the violator. This should be information given to the city so that immediately our city reports to the community. I shouldn't be hearing that only from KQED is the first time I hear it when I'm active, not only Good Neighbor Steering Committee, but I'm on the B Camp board as well. So it just doesn't make any sense, this way of communicating. Regulators are taking a passive approach to communication with immediately affected communities. This is why you don't have the public's trust, because it's too damn passive. Your own website is so complicated that if you try to, when I try to communicate to our public, you know what an effort that is? And now you're asking us, for instance, to write comments to the hearing board? No, you've recorded this meeting. You have all our comments. You record what we have already given to you very explicitly. You can synthesize it, but you have taken our record of comments. It's your job to take the time, because you're paid to do it, to give that list of comments to the hearing board. I can't take more time out of my days to write out more comments. And by the way, I commented on the Marathon EIR for their biofuels conversion project and also P66 conversion project. I haven't heard a word. I have not even heard a response to comments when that's coming out. I think the district should be on top of that. This is hugely important. And the idea that hydrogen sulfide monitors are not going to be in place, active and with verifiable data before January 2023, when these conversion projects may be a source of hydrogen that we're learning, hydrogen sulfide, we're learning about that. And I know that hydrogen sulfide is an emission from our asphalt plant, and we have people living right up the fence line, the buffer fence line with the asphalt plant. This is unacceptable. I don't want the district to be so passive about communication. It's sad. It's really sad. And I've driven into community BAQMD meetings all the way from Benicia, where I have to be there at 9:30 in the morning for a meeting. I can't do that anymore. You have to take our comment. If you're going to go out to the public, I remember when you started doing these kind of public workshops. I've gone to them in Richmond. I've gone to other meetings. But you need to collect what we say at these meetings and deliver it to the people where it makes a difference, whether it's the board, the hearing board, whoever. You make use of what we say to you.